In the next few lessons, we are going to be working on the wish list or favorites feature. So with our finished app open here, we can see that when we go into one of our categories, that we can click on our star here, and it stays starred. And then if we come back here, if we click on this star up here, it only shows the ones that we have favorited. So how are we going to store or keep track of favorites? Because these are individual to each user. I want you to pause the video and think about this. Where or how are we going to store the data to know which individual user has favorited which products? All right, so what did you come up with? You may have thought of adding an array to a user model of product document IDs. Then when we need to display the favorites, fetch the products from Firestore by ID. Maybe you thought of adding to each product an array of all the user IDs that have favorited it. Maybe you thought of adding a subcollection to a user object with copies of all the favorite products for that user. While each of these methods would work, and I'm sure there are other ways to do it as well, there are pros and cons to each. The way that I am going to show you is using the third method I mentioned. We are going to create a new sub-collection of each user called favorites, where we are going to add a copy of the product document for each product that is favorited, and then remove it when unfavorited. This may seem like a waste of resources duplicating data in multiple places, but this approach is very common in a NoSQL database like Firestore. This process is called denormalization. Basically, we are making duplicates of data to make our job of querying and fetching results easier. This way, to get our favorites, it is a straightforward call directly to a user's subcollection. All right, so we have a plan. We're going to add a favorites subcollection to our user document. But first, we need a user document, a place to store information about our user, which we currently do not have. So that's what we are going to start working on first. Let's come into our project, and we're going to create a new model. All right, so I'm going to right click and say new file. And this is just a Swift file. We are going to say user and say create. And here you can add anything you would like to store about your user. We'll be starting out with the basics: ID, email, username, and something we're going to be using in the future, which is the Stripe customer ID, okay? So let's create our struct. It's going to be called user. And our properties are as follows. We have an ID. This is going to be of type string. We have the email of the user, also of type string, and the user name. Actually, I'm going to make that all lowercase, of type string. And then we have the Stripe ID, which we will be using once we get to the Stripe section. And then let's go ahead and create our initializers and our static model to data function like we've been doing with our other models. It's going to say init. And we'll go ahead and say ID of type string. And we'll give some default initializers. Email of type string is equal to an empty string. User name of type string is equal to an empty string. And Stripe ID of type string equal to an empty string. And for our statements, we just say self.id is equal to ID. Self.email is equal to email. Self.username is equal to username. Self.stripeid is equal to stripeid. All right, so we have our default initializer. Next up, let's go ahead and create our initializer that we use when we get the data back from Firestore, in which case we are going to convert a dictionary into our instance of our user. So I'm going to say init. And for this, we get some data in the form of a dictionary of type string any. And we say ID is equal to data, where the key is ID. And we'll go ahead and cast that as a string and provide a default value. Then we have email, which is equal to data and email. We'll cast that as a string and provide a default empty string value. Then we have the username, which is equal to data, and the key is username. Cast that as a string and provide a default value. And finally, we have our Stripe ID, which is equal to data, get the value from the dictionary by providing the key as a string and provide a default value. All right, now let's go ahead and create our static model to data function where we take an instance of this model and convert it to a dictionary that is suitable to be uploaded as a Firestore document. And we call that function model to data. And you'll see that if I start typing out model to data, what I have is a code snippet that is already pre-filled to be basically what we need. So if you want to do something similar, if you want to have a shell for this, all you got to do is type this out, then highlight it, right click and say create code snippet. And then you can go ahead and put in the title of the code snippet, a summary, and then the completion shortcut. And this is where you saw what I had was model to data. That brings it up. Okay, so let me see if I can get rid of this. But for now, I'll go ahead and just type it all out. So I'm going to say static func model to data. And we're going to pass into this function a user, an instance of this model. And we're going to return a dictionary of type string and any. Then we're going to say let data equal. This is going to be an array, or I should say a dictionary of type string and any. And then we're going to return that data. All right, and the data that we need to return is a dictionary with the first being ID, the key, and the value user.id. Then we have email, where the value being user.email. Then we have username, where the value is user.username. And then we have Stripe ID, where the value is user.stripe ID. I'm just gonna clean up the spacing here a little bit. And that looks good. All right, great. So we have our user model, we have our initializers, and we have our model to data function all taken care of. I'm gonna save this. And now we need to figure out where and when we want to create this user document. So I think the best place is right after we register a new user. So come down to your register vc.swift file, and this is the code that runs when we click on register. We are creating a new registered Firebase user. Okay, so there's a difference between a Firebase authenticated user and the user document that we just modeled out here. Okay, so the Firebase authenticated user is what you see here under the authentication tab. Okay, the user document that we're talking about is going to be a document inside of a user's collection here. All right, so coming back into Xcode and back into register vc.swift, after we register a user, that's where we're going to create a new Firestore document user. All right, so this is me from the future. I made a dum-dum here. I am about to change the login code here because when recording this, I just completely forgot about our guest user functionality based on anonymous login, which is what is happening here with this link and retrieve function. Now, to avoid major confusion, go ahead and still follow along with me, and then at the end, I will come back in and we will correct my mistake. Sorry. Okay, back to the video. And after coming back and looking at this code, I'm not super happy with it because this is the way that you would do it if you were linking accounts. And I think this was carried over from when I was implementing Facebook authentication. And it's a little bit more wordy and verbose than we actually need. So I'm going to comment this out and show you the simpler way of doing it, which is simply to say auth auth.create user with email and password. Okay, so then all you got to do is pass in the email, the password, and we get our closure here, our completion. And I'll call this result and error. And that's it. We can go ahead and keep the error handling that we had previously. So I'm going to copy that and then uncomment it and then do Control-I to format it. And now instead of having to do guard let auth user, then manually creating the email auth provider credential, and then saying auth user.link and retrieve data, we simply say auth.auth.create user. Very good. All right, so now what we need to do is we're going to now upload a new user document. Okay, and this is going to go here under our root database as a collection called users. And we want the document ID of our users to be the same UID as an authenticated user. That way we'll be able to access it really easily. So coming back into Xcode, we need the Firebase authenticated user result here. So I'm going to say guard let fire user, and this is to differentiate between the fire user and the Artival user, is equal to result dot user dot, well, we'll just say result dot user. We just want the user object, else return. And the reason we want this fire user is so we can get the UID. And so now I'm going to create what I'm going to call the art user, and this is an instance of our user model that we just created. And I'm going to initialize it using this initializer here. And the ID is now our fire user dot UID. Email is email. Username is username. And for the Stripe ID, just do an empty string for now. And now we are ready to upload to Firestore. So I'm going to create a new function down here called func create Firestore user. And we're going to pass into this function a user that we just created. So I'm going to call that right here, self dot create Firestore user, and we're going to pass in art user. All right, so this should be old hat for you by now. I want you to try this on your own. We are going to be creating a new document in a new users collection, okay? So I'll write out the steps for you. Step 1, create document reference. Step 2, create model data. And step 3, upload to Firestore. All right, so go ahead and give that a shot, see if you can figure it out on your own. All right, how'd you do? First thing is, let's create our new user ref. And this is going to be equal to, starting with our Firestore root. Then we're going to have a new collection called users. And then we're going to be creating a new document with a specific ID where the user, or where the ID is the user's UID, so user.id. Then we create the data. So I'm going to say let data equal user.model to data, and that is our user. And now we upload to Firestore. So I'm going to say new user ref dot set data. And for most of the other times that we've been doing this, we've been using this one right here, where we set the data and we merge it and we have our completion. This is the function to create a brand new user document, so we shouldn't have to worry about merging. So I'm going to pick this one right here, set data with a completion handler. And the data is data completion. We have an optional error, so we'll go ahead and check for that. So we'll say if let error is equal to error. If there is one, we'll say auth.handle fire auth error. We'll pass in the error and the view controller self. And we'll also debug print the error. So we'll say error signing in, and then we'll string interpolate the error dot localized description. Else, if there's no error, then we were successful, and all we need to do is say self.dismiss animated true completion nil. And then we will stop the activity indicator, self.activity indicator.stop animating. Now let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to run it. Make sure you have the Artable scheme selected. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and say login. We're going to create a new user, and what we should expect to see is in our database, after we finish, we should see a new collection here with a new user document, okay? So let's go. I'm going to say Johnny, email, Johnny at newuser.com, 123123 for the password, and say register. All right, let's refresh this and see. All right, here we go, users collection, and we have our user document. Very good. Now, what we can do is we are able to add our new favorites collection right here. So that's what we'll be working on in the next lesson. I will see you there. But before we move on, we need to fix my error that I talked to you about earlier. So this is me from the future again, fixing this problem. So we are here in the register vc.swift file. And like I said, I just completely spaced the fact that we have anonymous login and guest users. And so what we need to do is this part that we commented out, go ahead and uncomment that. We are going to be using it. And this part right here, we can go ahead and comment out, and we're going to go back to how we had it before, okay? So just to recap what we got going on here is we are going to unwrap the auth user using auth.auth.currentUser. So this could be an anonymous user or a Facebook user. And then we are going to be creating a credential for this auth user. And then we are going to link and retrieve that data. Now you may see a warning like this depending on when you started this section and when you're viewing this video. So if you see link and retrieve data and you see a warning sign here saying that link and retrieve data has been deprecated, please use link with credential completion, then that's just a renaming of this method. So all we need to do is say .link with credential, and that should fix that warning. Okay, so now instead of finishing our activity here and dismissing, we are going to do the same thing that we did discuss when I was incorrect. This part is still correct, so I'm going to copy that, come down right here and paste it, and uncomment that with command / and then Control-I to format that correctly. And now we are back to where we want to be. So what we are doing is, again, just to recap, we are creating manually a credential so that we can link that with an existing user, whether it be anonymous or whatever it may be. And then we're going to link that. And then once that's done linking, we are going to create our Firestore user document, just like we discussed in this video. All right. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I apologize for my mistake. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave a question in this video. All right. So I will now see you all in the next one.